With a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, his love endures forever. Have you ever wondered what a mighty hand and an outstretched arm have to do with God's love? Well, there can really only be one answer. They refer to how violent it is. Hello, I'm David Lang, and this is Bible to Life, where we bring the Bible to life so that it can better impact your life. Now, when we sing about God's mighty hand and his outstretched arm, we have a vague notion that we're talking about God's power and might. But the ancient Israelites, when they sang those words, had a very definite story in mind and a very definite picture of what those words meant. The words come from Psalm 136, which is an antiphonal psalm. It's a psalm where the worship leader would have been reading one line, singing one line, and the congregation would have been responding with the phrase, "For his steadfast love endures forever." And that would have been the refrain which punctuated each statement that the worship leader made. And the worship leader recounts the story of God's faithful love in creation and in the Exodus from Egypt. So in verse 10, he turns from creation to the Exodus and he says, "To him who struck down the firstborn of Egypt, for his steadfast love endures forever, and brought Israel out from among them, for his steadfast love endures forever, with a strong hand and an outstretched arm, for his steadfast love endures forever." That's where the modern worship songwriters are getting those lyrics, right? With a mighty hand and outstretched arm, his love endures forever. That's straight out of Psalm 136. And Psalm 136 is picking up on the language of the Exodus. Here's the language that the ancient Israelites would have used to recount the story of the Exodus. "A wandering Aramean was my father, and he went down into Egypt and sojourned there, few in number, and there he became a nation, great, mighty, and populous. And the Egyptians treated us harshly and humiliated us and laid on us hard labor. Then we cried to the Lord, the God of our fathers, and the Lord heard our voice and saw our affliction, our toil and our oppression. And the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, with great deeds of terror, with signs and wonders. And he brought us into this place and gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey." So when the ancient Israelites heard about God's mighty hand and his outstretched arm, they immediately thought of the Exodus story. And they would have known exactly why that language was used, because they would have been familiar with the iconography of the Egyptian pharaohs. Here we see several reliefs depicting ancient Egyptian pharaohs in a kind of standard pose of triumph, where they have one hand outstretched, grabbing a subdued and kneeling enemy by the hair. And then the other mighty hand is back, holding a mace or a sword, ready to lop off or bash in the head of the subdued enemy. That was how ancient Egyptian pharaohs depicted themselves as triumphant. And God, in using this language, makes it clear, no, I'm the one who is bringing my people Israel out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. I'm holding Pharaoh and the Egyptian gods by the hair, and I'm striking them with plagues and disasters and terror and signs and wonders. That's how God demonstrated his love to Israel. The Exodus story is an epic story of a war between God and Pharaoh and the gods of Egypt. Pharaoh was seen as a god himself who was responsible for maintaining Ma'at, which was well-being and order. He was responsible for keeping back the chaos and making sure that the Nile flooded regularly every year, and that the crops grew every year, and that the locusts and other pests were held back. That was all seen as Pharaoh's job. And he did that by appealing to and cooperating with the gods of Egypt. And in the Exodus story, we have God coming in with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm and bringing Pharaoh and the gods of Egypt to their knees. He strikes the Nile, turning its water into blood. He raises up all of these different pests, the frogs and the flies and the gnats, and he strikes the livestock. So he's attacking the Egyptian goddess Hathor, who was the goddess of livestock and fertility. He attacks the sun god Ra in the darkness. He brings storm and hail and just completely wreaks havoc with the land of Egypt. And ultimately, he strikes at Pharaoh's ability to preserve life because he brings the plague against the firstborn. And again, God makes it clear, this is how I am triumphing over Pharaoh and the gods of Egypt. In Exodus 12:12, before Passover night, he says, I will pass through the land of Egypt that night, and I will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and on all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am the Lord. So God makes it clear that the Passover and the 10 plagues that culminate in the death of the firstborn are his way of executing judgment against Pharaoh and all the gods of Egypt. He brings them all to their knees and strikes them with his mighty hand. And that is how he shows his love for Israel, in bringing her out of Egypt and setting her free and giving her a land flowing with milk and honey. So it's important to understand that God's love is not passive. It rises to the defense of his people and does great violence to God's enemies. We have a tendency to want to declaw God's love somehow. But if you've ever had someone come to your rescue, you may be a teenager and you're fighting with your mom and dad all the time, but suddenly they rise to your defense against a teacher that's being unfair or against a bully or whatever it is. And you realize, hey, mom and dad really do love me. Or, it might be a sibling. You're constantly locking horns with your brother or sister. But if anybody else messes with your brother or sister, all of a sudden those differences are put aside and you rise to their defense. That's the nature of love. And we tend to soft pedal that when it comes to God's love. But God demonstrates his love for us by bringing those powers that hold us in bondage to their knees, bringing them into subjection, and defeating them with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, so that we can experience freedom and fellowship with him. And we see that even in the New Testament. In Colossians 2, Paul writes of our salvation as Christians through Jesus Christ and his cross. And you, who were dead in your trespasses and the uncircumcision of your flesh, God made alive together with him, having forgiven us all our trespasses, by canceling the record of debt that stood against us with its legal demands. This he set aside, nailing it to the cross. He disarmed the rulers and authorities and put them to open shame by triumphing over them in him. Many commentators believe that the rulers and authorities that Paul is talking about there are not merely earthly rulers and authorities, whom Jesus does triumph over by rising from the dead after his crucifixion, but that these are also demonic forces that want to keep us enslaved to sin and death. And Jesus cancels our debts by nailing them to the cross and sets us free and puts those demonic powers to shame, strips them of their authority over us, and wins us for himself. That's a powerful and wonderful picture of God's love. So the next time you sing a worship song that talks about God's mighty hand and his outstretched arm, think about how God came to your defense, how God came to your rescue and defeated your enemies with great violence.